Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and here we are back having a look at the podcast by Lex Fridman on ancient Rome. Now, this is of course the second episode. We've already done a full-on 40 minutes episode just reviewing a little section of it. But I have to admit, I had a pleasant surprise, because as you can see here, the man himself left a comment a day ago, and he was very, very humble about it, which is always something I very much appreciate. So he really took it for the constructive criticism that this was. Clearly this wasn't an attack to neither his guest nor him as the host, so that's very much appreciated. Absolutely make sure to subscribe to his podcast. And now, today, we're gonna review a very important section of this, the one about Cleopatra. Oh boy. Let's go. Okay, so this entire section is about 8 minutes long, so this can't take that long, can it? I mean, I don't know the final length of this video, you do, so you tell me in the comments if I need professional help.
You mentioned Cleopatra. If we go back to that, what role did she play? Another fascinating human being.
Cleopatra is interesting. I mean, she was a direct descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. When Alexander's empire had broken up, Ptolemy, this general, had seized control of Egypt, made it his kingdom. And she, 10 generations later, is a descendant of this Macedonian general. So Egypt had been ruled by, in essence, foreigners, these Macedonian dynasty of kings, and often they literally were ruled by this same dynasty because they had a habit of marrying brothers to sisters.
Very true. In fact, the highly documented practice of intermarriages within the Ptolemaic dynasty is one of the reasons why we cannot take the Netflix travesty of a documentary on Cleopatra seriously. So please.
And Cleopatra is in fact originally married to her younger brother. But despite that, she seems to have intensely identified with Egypt. In fact, she seems to have been
she's the only one who actually learned Egyptian.
Been the first one of all these Ptolemy kings who actually bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. So she seems to really have cared about Egypt as well.
100% agree.
And she was clearly very smart, very clever. And so she's living at a time...
I want to underline, when he says that she was really smart, I completely agree. The reason why he's saying that is because the sources tell us that. So he's not just saying it just to say it. He's saying it because clearly he knows the sources very well. And absolutely, when you read the sources, the period sources about Cleopatra, that is one of the characteristics. In fact, more than her beauty, which indeed, you know, it's not necessarily mentioned, it is her abilities, her political influence, and her smarts, her intelligence that actually shine through.
During the late Republic, when Rome is having all these civil wars, and Egypt is really the last big independent kingdom left around the shores of the Mediterranean. Everything else has been conquered by Rome.
No pressure, Cleopatra. Can you imagine that? Oh, goodness gracious.
Is in this very precarious position where clearly she wants to maintain Egyptian independence, but Rome is this juggernaut that's rolling over everything. And she ends up meeting Julius Caesar when Caesar comes to Egypt chasing Pompey, his great rival. After he defeats Pompey, Pompey runs to Egypt thinking he'll find sanctuary there.
I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to make it. Listen, he said nothing wrong. It's just the word Pompey. Pompey. Oh my gosh, I need a break. Pompey. I have nothing against using English versions of Latin names. Nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. You can say Julius Caesar, you can say Julius Caesar, whatever you want. It's just that the word, the sound of the name Pompey for generals. Oh my gosh, the great and powerful statesman Pompey. He did nothing wrong. Once again, call me what you want. God, Metatron, you're so arrogant. You're so condescending. You're so obnoxious. I can't stand you. Not everyone needs to know Latin. Fine. Call me whatever you want. Do it. It's just a Pompeius. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Just Pompeius sounds so much better than Pompey. It's not always the case, you know. Octavian sounds okay. Octavianus, I think, sounds better, but Octavian, it's okay. Pompey. Oh my gosh.
After Pompey runs to Egypt thinking he'll find sanctuary there, and the Egyptians kill him and chop off his head. And when Caesar lands, they hand it to him and say, "Here,
Pompey said.
have a present." And she, of course, famously ends up having a love affair with Caesar. Was that a genuine love, or was she just sort of, using this as a way to try and
Yeah, she was using that. It wasn't genuine.
keep Egypt independent, to give it some status? We don't know.
Okay, I'm not going to say 100%. Not going to say 100%, but I am going to say that I can confidently state that 99% this was an absolute political maneuver. Her romantic entanglement with Julius Caesar was absolutely a political maneuver. I mean, think about it for a second. Here's how I'm going to defend that. He clearly very well described the geopolitical situation of ancient Rome and Egypt at this time. So what are the chances that she just so happened to romantically fall in love for the one guy who is one of the most powerful and influential people of that very juggernaut, as the professor cleverly said, of the one republic that could take over Egypt? I mean, it's a political maneuver through the means of seduction and power display. 99%. But this is not just a matter of deductive logic. There are some actual contextual clues that can really help us understand, yeah, this is probably the case. Think of it this way. Cleopatra has kids with Julius Caesar. If he actually becomes the new king, the new emperor, as that's what it looked like at the time, then she would become the co-ruler, because he would be the father of her kids. So she would ensure for her children a royal dynasty connected to one of the most powerful political entities of the ancient world. And this idea of Cleopatra being a co-ruler, that fits perfectly with the Ptolemaic culture and system. You see, he did mention the beginnings of the Ptolemaic dynasty when he was talking about Alexander the Great, one of his generals. And the thing is that since the very beginning, female regents were co-rulers in the Egyptian dynasty, and we can go all the way back to Cleopatra I, because of course, when we talk about the famous Cleopatra, we're talking about Cleopatra VII, which means there were 6 Cleopatras before her. And by examining all sorts of evidence, whether it be cultural, literary, papyrological, numismatic, you will see that female rulers, specifically in this context, enjoyed more power than any other culture of the time. And when it comes to Cleopatra I, who was the daughter of the Seleucid king Antiochus III, she was the very first one to gain grip of that power. Cleopatra I already did this. So this idea of becoming co-rulers, this idea of staying relevant as a woman together with a powerful man in conjunction, is something that has been for generations within the Ptolemaic Egyptian culture, and she's not gonna give that up. Which is why I believe that this was not a random, oh, she just happened to fall in love with Julius Caesar. Yeah, no.
After she does have several kids with Caesar. After Caesar's assassinated and the Roman world is having another civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is basing himself in the East. He meets Cleopatra, and he has a big love affair with her. And this one seems pretty genuine. I mean, Antony and Cleopatra, there's a lot of stories about them kind of partying together. They like to sort of cosplay and dress up as different gods. So Cleopatra would dress up as the goddess Isis, and Antony would dress up as the god Dionysus in a leopard skin, and they'd have these big parties and stuff. And they had...
Okay, right. How am I going to put it? I do have a little bit of an issue with the way he presented this information about the way Cleopatra and Mark Antony dressed up as gods. Once again, I understand it. I don't want this to sound too pedantic. I don't want this to sound arrogant or me just nitpicking. So if that's the feeling you're getting, that's not my intention, so I apologize for that. But I do wish to kind of provide further depth to the statement that he made, not again as a way to attack the professor, because of course he's trying to be funny, and I appreciate that. You know, he sounds like a really cool guy. I would really enjoy a beer with him. But the way he described this, so the idea of ancient rulers dressing up as gods, particularly in the Egyptian context, is extremely deep. There is a lot that has been written about it, both in period and subsequently modern academia, and it absolutely was not extravagant. Like, the way he's explaining it now makes it sound, oh, they were partying, they were having fun, it was kind of weird, they were cosplaying. No, it's a lot deeper than that. So once again, I'm not saying he doesn't know this, but I'm saying I think the audience might misunderstand this as, oh, they were being extravagant, they were just partying, having fun. But no, there is a lot to say about them dressing up as gods, specifically these gods. So let me tell you a little bit about it. First of all, within Egyptian culture, the ruler is divine. A pharaoh is a living god. So in this case, from the perspective of ancient Egyptian, it's a god transforming or taking the aspect of another god. In this case, Isis. So this wouldn't have been neither extravagant nor foreign, nor they are being a little nutter, or they are joking around, or while they're partying. No, this was very cemented practice within Egyptian culture, and in fact, we know that Alexander the Great himself was aware of this and participated in this very peculiar Egyptian custom. As I have mentioned on my dedicated video to Alexander the Great, you'll find a link in the description. Already, when you compare Egyptian religion with, for example, Christian religion, there is a very stark difference when it comes to the way God, or the gods for them, were represented, in the sense that, differently from any form of biblical religion, the Egyptians continuously represented their gods and goddesses in visual form. And during her reign in Egypt, Cleopatra strongly connected herself to the Egyptian goddess Isis. This, in fact, was not something that, as we said, made sense in culture and in period, but it was also her way to not only legitimize herself as a ruler, but also to connect that very native culture that in reality she really wasn't part of, because as we said, she was Greek. But as the professor eloquently pointed out, she was the one ruler that really wanted to connect with the people. She learned their language, and therefore connecting herself with Isis, a local indigenous Egyptian goddess, was a great way to connect to the people. And what's interesting is that this very strategy was extremely effective, because not only worked within the province or the area of Egypt, not a province yet, but also outside. In fact, Cleopatra VII had a significant impact on the cult of Isis in Rome. We have evidence that she carefully curated a very strong connection between herself and Isis to be sent to the Romans and to the Greeks, and it worked. To the point that all of this religious propaganda actually ended up and resulted in the construction of one of the major Isis temples in Rome, the Temple of Isis Campense. And after that very defeat that the professor mentioned, when Mark Antony loses and now Octavian is in power, led to the persecution of this temple. So the connection was extremely strong. So when we look at the event that the professor is mentioning, these parties, it's not a cosplay. I know that I am being nitpicky, I understand that. But I do also want the audience to really grasp that this is not just them having fun and being silly, but her willful transformation into the goddess was in fact a form of strong conversation between different cultures. Eventually in Rome, something similar happens, with the emperor being partially divine at least, but it won't be as explicit as it was in Egypt.
End up together fighting against Octavian. And in the end, they're defeated by Octavian. And Antony commits suicide. Cleopatra, there's differing accounts of her death. She may have also killed herself, or she may actually have been killed by Octavian.
No, Octavianus did not kill Cleopatra.
To just get her out of the way. But she's an interesting figure because she was...
Okay, I need to kind of... this is going to be long as well. I need to talk about that. As we read the sources, which we will, I'll share them with you in a second, but there are indeed two postulations when it comes to the way she died. And we don't really know which one it is. I'll show you both. I'll tell you what both are, and, the indications that point to one or the other. But definitely, Octavianus did not kill her. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we know that he surely had plans to bring her in chains to Rome for his triumph. So she definitely offed herself. Now, even though the snake story is clearly the one that has become most popular because it's very romanticized and it's, very striking as something that you can imagine, as I was saying, there are two versions. The first one we find mentioned in Strabo, and specifically in his Geography 1710. So let me see if I can find the passage and read it to you. Augustus Caesar honored this place because it was here that he conquered in battle those who came out against him with Antony. And when he had taken the city at the first onset, he forced Antony to put himself to death and Cleopatra to come into his power alive. But a little later, she too put herself to death secretly, while in prison, by the bite of an asp, or, for two accounts are given, by applying a poisonous ointment. When it comes to the second account, it comes from Plutarch in his Life of Antony 86, and we read, "It is said that the asp was brought with those figs and leaves and lay hidden beneath them, for thus Cleopatra had given orders, that the reptile might fasten itself upon her body without her being aware of it. But when she took away some of the figs and saw it, she said, 'There it is, you see, and bearing her arm, she held it out for the bite. But others say that the asp was kept carefully shut up in a water jar, and that while Cleopatra was stirring it up and irritating it with a golden distaff, it sprang and fastened itself upon her arm. But the truth of the matter no one knows, for it was also said that she carried about poison in a hollow comb, and kept the comb hidden in her hair, and yet neither spot nor other sign of poison broke out upon her body. Moreover, not even was the reptile seen within the chamber, though people said they saw some traces of it near the sea, where the chamber looked out upon it with its windows. And some also say that Cleopatra's arm was seen to have 2 slight and indistinct punctures, and this Caesar also seems to have believed. For in his triumph, an image of Cleopatra herself, with the asp clinging to her, was carried in the procession. These, then, are the various accounts of what happened.
Because she was clearly a very smart woman who managed to keep Egypt alive as an independent state.
She actually didn't manage to do that. She eventually failed. But, also because at the end of the day, Egypt was conquered by Roman forces in 30 BC, was annexed and became a province of the new Roman Empire. So there is that.
And identified with it, and succeeded at a time with all these famous people, in being a real kind of mover and shaker and a force in events.
I mean, she's probably one of the most influential women in human history.
Okay, that's an interesting statement. As I say, I really like Lex Fridman. I do want to kind of jump into this statement and dissect it a little bit. Was Cleopatra one of the most influential women in history? Well, it kind of depends on how we look at it. If we look at it in period, then, well, yes, in period she would have been extremely influential also because she dealt with one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful entity in the world, aka the Roman Republic, and soon to become empire. But if we look at this statement by the way usually people mean it, what does it mean to be one of the most influential women in history? It means that your influence is connected and affects the life of people after you. Usually that's what you mean. Like in the same way we could say that the Roman Empire or ancient Greeks were extremely influential when it comes to the beginning and building of Western civilization. This is usually what we mean, is the way this influence carries over through the century. In fact, it strides across the century. And clearly when we talk about women, was she one of the most influential women in history in the way her story or her image influenced women today? No, not really. If they had won, and the first emperor had become Mark Antony rather than Octavianus Augustus, and then she would have been the co-ruler of the new Roman Empire, very possible that then she may have passed laws and policies that could have in fact affected the way governments were shaped. And then so in that way, I would say, yes, maybe she could have become one of the most influential women in history. But she didn't win. She is indeed famous. Everybody has heard of Cleopatra, although then again, that's not necessarily because of the historical accounts, but mostly because of TV, the media, and Shakespeare. But still, very important historical character, very fascinating and intriguing historical character. I wouldn't say she's one of the most influential, however.
She's certainly, again, she's someone that her image is incredibly important.
Yeah, you see how he responded? Because he's thinking the same thing. He is thinking, well, not that influential, really, but she is important. So you could tell in the way he responded. We agree on that.
And I mean, one of the interesting things, the whole question of gender in the Roman world. I mean, this gets into Roman sources, but of course it's a heavily male-dominated history. And
yeah.
I mean, men and women did not have equality in ancient Rome. It's a male-dominated society. It's misogynist in many ways.
Is it misogynist? I mean, compared to the modern period, yes. But does it even make sense to compare it to the modern period? I personally wouldn't call it misogynist. Compared to other cultures, Roman women had a better situation, particularly if you had status. But then again, if you compare it to women in the Celtic tradition, sure, they could own some land. But then again, women in Greece, I don't know, the idea of calling the ancient Roman misogynistic sounds weird. And it's once again one of those red flags for me that make it feel like the professor, in this case, is applying modernism to the ancient period, which is always something that I strongly resent. The society was surely patriarchal, but misogynistic?
But what I'm constantly struck by is when you start again delving into the sources, you always hear, okay, well, there was this one woman who was a philosopher, and she's an exception to the rule. And yeah, okay, she's fine. And then you start looking into, and there's also 60 other female philosophers. well, is that so much an exception anymore? Or, Cleopatra is the one queen. She's this strong queen. And then you look and, well, there was this other queen here. There was this queen here. There was this queen here who led armies. And here's another
Still exceptions.
one who led armies. And again, it's like, well, are they exceptions to the rule? Or is
Yes, they are.
just the history that was written, which is written by men, a little bit selective in how it portrays them? Because the sources are all these male elites who have very definite ideas about women.
Look at Lex. Oh my gosh, Lex Fridman, my friend. I know exactly what you're thinking right now. I'm thinking it too. We're all thinking it. I agree with you. You don't even need to say it. You're right. It is what it is. I'll let the professor finish, and then I'll do a strong comeback. I would like you to, however, understand this. I'm the guy with no political agenda. I have nothing that I'm trying to push, but the sources and the truth that is based on documented facts. So, even though in this case the professor seems to be having a very modernist approach, and he also appears to be defending this idea that, oh, it's because men hated women and so they removed women from all of the sources. I would like to underline that even though I'm going to counter that, do keep in mind that I am the guy who made this video about the truth and sources of actual women warriors. So I have no agenda that I'm here trying, oh, I need to dismantle all forms of feminism because men are men. No, I just look at the sources. When the sources do speak towards a certain direction, I will say it, like I did on this video that got me quite a lot of hate, in fact, from people calling me woke and all of that. But at the same time, and I even made a response to that, but at the same time, in this case, I do have a lot to say. And yes, people will now, from the other side, will now call me, oh, you're misogynistic, you're racist and whatever, you're a right-wing grifter. I don't care about that. I just care about the truth. So I'm going to let the professor finish, and then I'll do a strong comeback based on evidence and the sources.
The conventional notion has always been that, business in the Roman Empire was a male field. Well, but then there's this woman, Eumachia in Pompeii, who actually had the largest building in Pompeii right on the Forum named after her with a giant statue of her, and she was a patron to a bunch of the most important guilds in Pompeii. Okay, she's the exception to the rule. Oh, but then there's these other 4 women we have from Pompeii who also were patrons of guilds. And then there's this woman, Plancia Magna, in this other place. And she was the most important patron in the town and put up all these statues. So at some point, when do you start to say, well, maybe women did play more of a role, but they just haven't been recorded in the sources in the way that maybe they deserve to be?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Is it the bias of society, or is it the bias of the historian? The bias of the society that the historian is writing about, or the bias of the actual historian?
And the bias of the historians who have written history up to this point.
Yeah.
I was just writing a lecture which was about this woman, Musa, who is a crazy story. And she ties...
Okay, so before he continues, I'd like to, as I say, respond, then we'll see. Of course, these examples that he's bringing up, the fact that there were some women that had some business influence in Pompeii is absolutely true. Also, I wish he had provided some context, though, because a lot of the time, and that is a fact, women that had power had it because of their husbands. That is a fact. It's not always the case. As I say, there are absolutely exceptions in history, and I'll be the first one to defend them when I'm like, no, this woman, for example, did lead troops into battle, but oftentimes, as I will provide evidence, it is a connection. The status the women had was connected to the husband, to the sons, and just it is what it is, because as he said, it is a patriarchal society. So which one is it? It's either a patriarchal society or it's not, and then women are just as powerful as men. It's one of the two, and they are mutually exclusive. But now, let's go back onto the idea of Rome being misogynistic. Let's remember that Roman women had no political rights, and in reality even civil rights were relatively low, in the sense that they always had to be protected by a male individual of the family, even after the death of the paterfamilias. An important element that carries weight is the fact that women didn't have a praenomen, that is, an individual name, but were indicated by the family name, so nomen, and only had this and the cognomen, signaling a total absorption into the family structure. However, as I was saying, it's not like other women were better off in this period. Greek women were absolutely in a worse condition than Roman women. Celtic women, as I was saying, they had their own personal capital, but we do know that if their husband had died in, for example, unclear circumstances, by law, his relatives were allowed to interrogate her under Tor, if they suspected that she may have been involved in it. So that's not a great situation when it comes to civil rights in the Celtic reality. So in short, if you really want to look at it from the perspective of modern times, then everyone was misogynistic, not just Rome. I understand it didn't say that only Rome was misogynistic, but to me it's just a useless exercise to do that, because it's a projection of the way things are right now into a period where everything was like this. And in fact, if anything, Roman women, as he goes forward to show, had more opportunities than in other places. This is why, in my opinion, when looking at classical societies, the correct term is not misogyny. They were patriarchal.
Isn't to Augustus, actually. Augustus, his biggest diplomatic triumph that he boasted about constantly was that about 50 years before him...
See the importance of triumphs for Augustus, which is why... or Augustus, which is why I was mentioning the thing about Cleopatra.
The Romans had sent an expedition into Parthia, this neighboring kingdom, led by Crassus, and they'd gotten wiped out. So it was this big disaster, military disaster. And the standards of the Roman legions, the eagles that each Roman legion carried, had been captured by the Parthians. And this is the most humiliating thing that can happen to a Roman legion, to have its eagles captured. And Augustus desperately wanted to negotiate with the Parthians to get these eagles returned. Okay, this was his big diplomatic thing. So he was constantly sending these embassies to Parthia. On one of these embassies, he sent along as a gift to the Parthian king a slave woman named Musa. Musa seems to have pleased the king of Parthia because she becomes one of his concubines. And then she gives birth to a son by the king, and eventually she becomes upgraded to the level of wife. And Musa eventually murders the Parthian king, arranges it so that her son becomes the king of Parthia, and she's really ruling the whole empire behind the scenes as his mother.
Thank you, Professor, for bringing it up. But could you imagine if this was actually orchestrated all the way through the Roman Emperor, and that was the reason why he gave her as a gift? Oh my gosh, that would be metagaming. I mean, that would be... I wouldn't put it past the Romans, to be honest. And I don't know if he's gonna go there. Probably not. Just a little intuition of mine. Could you imagine if this was orchestrated?
So this is a literal rags to riches story of a slave, someone who starts out a slave and becomes the queen of an empire almost as large and powerful as Rome. Okay? But yet, how often do we hear about Musa? And
he does have a point. I think this would be, and I agree with that sentiment, by the way, which is one of the reasons why I made this video, the African warrior queen who fought against the Roman Empire, who is Amanirenas, because again, yes, there are absolutely women in history that you never hear about in historical education, but then again, there are a lot of things you don't hear about in historical education. I don't think this is a matter of, oh, they're trying to hush-hush, hide the women. I just think that the historical education, particularly when it comes to middle school and high school, is abhorrent. There is so much that is not taught, and there are so many things that are instead inserted in the curricula that don't really need to be there. So yeah, that could be an entire discussion about the educational system, but then I don't want to make this too long. So for now, I'll just say I agree with him. Just leave it at that.
And when you look in traditional histories of Roman-Parthian relations, and I went and looked at this because I was just writing this lecture, most of those histories didn't even mention her. They just talked about her son, like he had just come out of nowhere and become the new heir to the Parthian throne, when it was all her doing, clearly. Now that's selective editing of history by historians to downplay the role that this woman played. And there's a lot of examples like that.
That's fascinating.
She got overthrown after a few years. There was a revolution against her, and we don't know what happened to her then. But she's a really interesting figure. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, Augustus did negotiate the return of the Parthian standards and got them back.
The cuirass.
He's
so gonna mention the cuirass now, because I am aware of that one. I'm a maniac for armor.
Out of this, that this is what he constantly boasted about. And the most famous statue of Augustus, the Augustus from Prima Porta, which is in the Vatican today, he's wearing a...
Yeah, Prima Porta is one of my favorite statues ever.
Breastplate, and on the breastplate, right in the middle of the stomach, is a Parthian handing over a golden eagle, legionary standard, to a Roman. So this is what Augustus thought of as his greatest achievement. And that embassy that arranged that was the one that sent Musa to Parthia.
So Augustus Mark.
Fascinating, and I think this concludes this section. I'm gonna have to say thank you to Lex for organizing everything in such an easy way. So please check out his podcast. Look at these sections. You have one on Roman law, slavery. We have one on Octavianus, Alexander the Great. We have one on armor. You know me. So just let me know in the comments which one you want me to review next, and I'll absolutely do that and continue this series. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Professor Aldrete. Of course, thank you, Lex, and I hope that you enjoyed this, and I will see you for my next daily upload tomorrow. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.